Mr. Booker, I just wanted to give you.
Thank you. We're all set. Well, don't fool with it. It would be great if we could, but if we cannot, then don't fool with it.
Okay.
I could
Okay.
al-
We got 7 minutes. Okay.
Okay.
So what is the website?
It's if you type in
Shoot. I just got it. Okay.
Buchdal, B-U-C-H
UCH.
D-A-H-L,
DAHL.
2019. Try it.
So let's see here. If I could give that to you, please. You can just put this.
Sennheiser?
This is a Sennheiser, so it
Yeah, I
sounds
got
like
the
you
same
know what to
thing.
do then. Okay. So yeah, so this is put that
I'm
on somewhere.
running my mouth.
It's
Yeah.
already on.
Yeah.
I'll just adjust the levels as we go.
So I'm supposed to sign this, right? Tell me what I'm supposed to. It's helpful just be very direct with me.
I know my way around this a little bit.
Dollar amount here is it?
Good. I'm glad to hear. We might call you back.
I'll give you my wife's
Thank
account.
you.
No problem. Do me a favor, please. Can you clamp this on my belt? Because those are very hard to do.
Yeah, like gosh, they are.
Awesome. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do that. I'm sorry.
Oh, you're.
Oh. Do we have a? Oh.
Yeah.
Question. Do we have a seating arrangement?
Downhill substantially then.
Do we have a seating arrangement up there, or we just sit?
Just sit wherever you want up there in the club chairs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Why don't I see, they, just beware, they're on rollers, and there's no locks on them, so just beware, I'm gonna tell other panelists that.
Perfect.
Okay.
Me?
Yeah, I got a question. These are coming out like super dark.
Well, besides jumping, wait.
You like my plane?
No. How do I go back?
Oh, you're doing it the right way.
Yeah, see?
Oh, where?
Don't worry about it. I can lighten them up. 'Cause those are raw. They're raw images, so
Is John?
they're not even in JPEG form yet. So once I put them in JPEG form, it'll change all of that. Now, also, if you want to change the f-stop on there, you can.
I would want to make it,
Okay.
right? I'm asking. Or would I want to make it larger?
Because X-Stop also controls your like how much of the background you get like blurred out. Okay, yeah.
Well,
Thank you.
got it. Stop that. That is you. I have a lot of faith and promise in you. More than you have in yourself, Sean. But then again, you do this. Okay, so it's a back and forth thing.
Yeah.
I can deal with that.
Figure out what's a good place.
Anywhere.
Love it. Thanks.
Okay. You need a chair? What do you do? How many? One or two? Not twins, is it?
I'm not wrong.
Is it no twins, right?
No, it's just
Okay. Oh, I asked that because I have twins. So how big is the measuring while we asking? How big is he measuring right now?
So Dr. Kelly and Andre in the back. Do you know where other people are? Yeah, she's my Andre.
Because we had twins, and one was 6 pounds 7 ounces, the other was 7 pounds 7 ounces, and they went 38 weeks. So, do you want me to get somebody to get you a chair?
So they might not be here at any time.
Let me go. No, I'm gonna get somebody to get you one.
You got a minute.
I'm black.
You're very optimistic.
Hey, I have a question.
Get a minute. So,
Is there
okay.
anybody that can get a chair? We have a
Well,
pregnant
I'll
woman
bring
there
this
that's
to the
gonna be sitting in the back.
You can just
So we
point
have
them out then. Yes.
another chair.
Thank
Hey,
you.
how you doing?
Yeah, I think
There's a woman who's pregnant, and I was just trying to get a more comfortable chair for her. I don't know. She in and to the left. She's sitting on the wall.
It's a tough crowd. I always figure crowds like that, we're good at what. Unless you haven't arrived yet, you can keep that.
Sorry, excuse me.
Yeah, that would be great.
You good?
Yeah.
Why the way doing the brown jacket? I felt like W.E.B. Du Bois from the side. Who, me? Why I gotta be all that? The first time I saw it, I was like, wow. I thought you'd been dead, bro. Yeah, they wouldn't even let me sign. I was like, fine, be like that. If there's alcohol in it, I'll hold it.
So much stuff.
Folks,
I guess the panelists go up front. How did the fuck sign me up for this? I didn't even agree to it. I mean, I don't. I remember my response saying, "Yeah, that sounds cool. Who's the panel?"
that's Karen.
Weird. They told me not to sign. Like literally, I'll sign.
This fella's
it,
gonna
bro.
mic you.
That was just
Folks,
weird.
is this on? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? There are lots of seats up front. And we're just waiting for one of our panelists. Come on down, take a seat. Please, grab a seat.
It's just for the recording and the live stream for the microphone. Yes. Hey, how you doing?
Hi, how you doing, sir?
Hey, Raj, I'm Vijay.
I'll see you next week.
Oh, nice to meet you. I'm part of the AV team. You too.
Thanks for shooting. So,
So you giving me sign language on Karen?
Good to see you again. It's been a while.
Yeah, it has. So, we got.
If I could give you that.
I'd rather be shot. Now, what about? I really don't need a mic. Yeah.
Well, it's for the.
I know. So let's do it this way. She's downstairs. The magazine she just
in the front row.
showed up.
Turn around, Dr. Kelly.
I don't want to.
And myself. And there's
Thanks.
I'm talking to people. I'll talk to people.
And then
This whole.
Dr. Booker Ramsey.
But you know what? It's a chance.
Oh yeah, that's good. And students.
Yeah. Wonderful range of people here.
Yeah.
So you thought you was too?
Yep.
Up north.
Yep.
I'm just
Yeah.
saying.
Do you know Carmine Prioli?
I haven't had a chance to see you much, so don't dismiss me, Sister Girl.
This is Carmine Prioli.
Sorry to interrupt. How do you do?
I'm sorry.
How do you do? Real pleasure.
This is his old
about
stomping ground.
I'll
So
make a
he's
better
come to see if I'm
effort to do
behaving.
it ahead of time instead of people. So it's rude to invite you knowing that you might be busy. But then I don't know if you are busy.
Anytime.
Then I would do that. Then I apologize. I'm sorry.
I probably would be like, oh yeah.
This is the kind of thing that we do really well.
And I get that.
Just because I'm not
Now, what
I'm in history department.
history? Yeah, most of my friends were history when I first got here.
All right, so I got this microphone. I think so.
Jim Crisp, is he still hanging out?
Jim just retired. We can stop.
Yeah, I don't have any more physical classes. We have presentations and
Yeah. And you were meeting one of my academic heroes.
Honestly, I'm going to be pretty easy.
She's trying to get rid of her garbage.
Carmine.
I'm Karen.
This is my close assistant.
That's right, exactly. Too long.
because you were like, yeah, I'm busy all this month. Yeah, I'm busy all that month. Yeah, I'm not gonna be here.
Yeah,
then.
you should
Yeah, I'm
retire
going on
too
an
soon.
adventure. There you
I
go.
know,
That's
you
you right
gotta,
there.
yeah.
I'm just saying.
I'm looking for
But
the
I saw
door
some
right.
volleyball players the other day.
Back. I'm looking for the door right. I'm done. I'm done.
Okay, see the young lady right there?
I'm overdone.
The one that says Happy Economics.
I'm like
She's
Burtonville
from
Chris.
Holland. She works. She
But there's other stuff like this. This is kind of stuff like, you know, I'm an evangelist.
Pumped up when I come to these things.
I'm an evangelist, and
I'm sorry, I keep forgetting.
So I agree with the whole handshaking thing. Yeah. Because
Baxter is she's the photographer, and Ryan is the
Dr.
Ryan
Kelly,
is
where are you
the
sitting so I know where I can
Emerson's website. Yeah, and they are so ingrained in us.
They're amazing. Actually, they're everywhere. In fact, he saw me and he said he was going down to get you, and he said, "Come on now." And we went down, and you were coming up the
I said,
elevator. But,
I mean, they're so committed. Yes. Oh yeah, they say the Worcester House.
Actual research.
They do a website. I mean, they've just taken us. They got a big investment in the gift shop. They've taken us into the 21st century, kicking and screaming. So.
Empty seats up here, people. Come on down. And if you have one of those seats, you better take it.
Pray for me.
I've got three on this
Throw
side
that
right
under.
These seats right here. If there's an empty seat next to you, would you raise your hand?
Is this where I'm supposed to
Oh
sit?
my goodness, there's so many empty seats. All y'all clustered in the back. There's seats, that's you, Derek. There's an empty seat up here for you.
I've given Carmine my pocketbook. How do you feel?
One person sitting there. Go ahead, sit there.
There's one more seat right here in front of me. Empty seat right here. Adam, you like to slouch? You'd rather slouch? Okay. That's
Dr.
fine.
Kelly, let me pass you your water now.
So there's yet one more up front.
You're welcome.
Two more.
Okay, well, I'm using this so that our voices will be picked up by the recording. We're being recorded for posterity and for those who cannot be here. And I'm very pleased. My name is Matthew Booker. I'm an associate professor in the history department, and I direct the Science, Technology, and Society program here at NC State. I'm really pleased to be able to moderate tonight's panel and introduce the panelists and also give a little introduction to why we're all here tonight and why we're here in this wonderful place. So I want to begin with some important acknowledgments. First, I want to thank Interdisciplinary Studies in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, and especially Dr. Blair Kelly, who is here on the end, Assistant Dean for Interdisciplinary Studies in that college. Arancessu Lascurain, who's in the back, still taking care of business, and the staff, all of the staff at the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, who worked so hard for so long with Dr. Kelly to make this work. I want to thank the Global Change Fellows of the Southeast Climate Science Center for the work they did to set this up and for being here in the force. And I especially want to thank Dr. Sechelle Ford and Mr. John Miller of the African American Cultural Center and the center staff for the welcome, the kindness that they've shown, and for offering this space for all of us to meet. It's a real pleasure for me to acknowledge that collaboration. I want to thank Baxter Miller, who's here, and Ryan Stansel, who's, I think, lurking in the back. There he is. Artists who created this exhibition. I want to thank the History Department at NC State, particularly Dr. David Zonderman and Elizabeth Brum, who helped organize the poster session in particular and really pushed the collaboration between history and science that informs this, and art that informs this exhibition. I want to thank the North Carolina Sea Grant, who funded the original exhibit that we are witnessing in the background here and that we will be talking about in a few minutes. And not least, I want to thank Ricky Moore, Chef Ricky Moore of Saltbox Joint, for the special menu, for the special menu he has created today to help us understand the coast and the sustainable fisheries that we have here in North Carolina. And finally, all of the students and staff who helped put this event together. So that's a lot of thank yous, but we can't leave out any of those people because without you, it wouldn't have happened and won't be happening. So I just want to say one more thing about the collaboration between the various entities that made possible this exhibit before I introduce our panelists and get us underway. It's a real pleasure, and I think an unlikely and uncommon pleasure, to see the way that colleges and various disciplines collaborated to make this event happen. And I think this is the first time, I know it's the first time in my 15 years at NC State, that I have seen an event which is co-hosted by the African American Cultural Center, by the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, and by the Southeast Climate Science Center, or another science program on campus. NC State has many collaborations across disciplines, but this particular combination is particularly meaningful to me because it represents the urgency of one of the most profound questions and problems facing our society, which is climate change. Climate change is real, it's happening, it's us, it's here in North Carolina. And it's not happening randomly across the state or across our country or this world. It's happening to some communities more than others. Mike, do you want to make this happen again? So we don't have to look at the bell tower? Thank you, it's been great. So what do I mean by it's happening to some communities more than others? Historically, African American communities in the inner coast, working class communities in the Outer Banks and especially in the Inner Banks, along the water, down low in eastern North Carolina, those are the communities that are facing climate change first, and they're the ones who are being hit hardest. And that's what the storms of the last years have shown us. It's not randomly distributed across the landscape. Climate change is not an abstraction that happens everywhere all at once. It happens to some of us more than others. It hurts some of us more than others. And to flip the script a little bit, there are stories about resilience, lessons learned about survival in hard places that we can learn from those communities. Communities like Harkers Island, communities like Princeville, North Carolina, communities like Robeson County, North Carolina. So what I'm so excited about in this collaboration, I think we're going to hear more about it, is that combination of skills and interests, history, resilience that I think is going to emerge tonight. So that's a lot of me talking, especially since I have a bad cold and you can hear it. So I want to now introduce our panelists, and I'm going to tell you what the plan is for the rest of this evening. The plan is I'm going to introduce our panelists, and I'm going to ask them to speak for just 5 minutes about their perspective on this exhibit, this event, and the places and communities depicted in these photographs and recorded in the oral histories that are also available, as we will see later. Then I might ask some follow-up questions, and then I'm going to open it up to a conversation with you, the audience. That's the real goal of this exhibit, and the reason I think that Baxter and Ryan and Sea Grant and Karen and everybody is here today is to engage with the stories that you have about sea level rise, about North Carolina's coast. And finally, we're going to recess to the second floor to enjoy a student poster session and what I think is going to be a fabulous reception catered by Chef Ricky Moore of Saltbox in Durham. So Eastern North Carolina is in the house tonight, and it is in the house also in the form of some really good food. Okay, so that's the plan. So I want to introduce our panelists tonight and then get them talking. So on the end is Dr. Blair Kelly. She is Assistant Dean for Interdisciplinary Studies in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. She oversees a range of departments and much of the programs abroad that this university has. She's also, in particular, I think this is relevant for us tonight, she's in charge of Africana Studies, Art Studies, and Science, Technology, and Society, all of which are deeply implicated in the stories we're going to be talking about tonight. She is a scholar of the African American experience, she's a public historian, and she's an expert on oral history who has taught about Hurricane Katrina as an unnatural disaster. Baxter Miller, next to me here, is a photographer, a documentary filmmaker, and a story maker who took the photographs that make up the Rising exhibit we are celebrating today. Baxter and her partner, Ryan Stansel. Hands up. Ryan, where are you at? There he is, in the back. Collaborated with a remarkable group of people, funded by the North Carolina Sea Grant and the Keenan Institute, to make this exhibit that is designed to circulate around North Carolina, these images that are in the background and that we're going to see in the flesh in a few minutes. Next to Baxter is Karen Zomspacher, who has been executive director of the Core Sound Waterfowl Museum for 29 years. I think that's right, Karen?
A long time.
A long time.
Forever.
She's the author of Living at the Water's Edge, a heritage guide to the Outer Banks byway. She's an educator in every sense of the word. She's an important and respected advocate for the communities of coastal North Carolina. And thank you for driving up here that long way. I really appreciate it. Next to Karen is Andre Taylor. Andre is a graduate student in the Public History program at NC State. He's a Global Change Fellow of the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. Andre studies agricultural traditions in the Gullah Geechee communities of South Carolina and Georgia. He's a professional journalist who last week won a prize for Deadline News reporting from the North Carolina Press Association. So congratulations, Andre. Of course, we know that your future is in history, but that's all right. That's all right. Go ahead and keep winning prizes. So at this point, I want to ask our panelists to speak, and so I'm going to start with you, Blair, if that's all right. Blair, why did you and Aransas Laskarine from the Climate Science Center team up to bring this exhibit to NC State, and why here at the African American Cultural Center?
So, thank you, Matthew. Aransas has been an incredible partner in this work, this project. We started a conversation last year about the use of oral history in science. And she's invited me to sort of spearhead that conversation, to talk with some climate scientists, to think about the ways in which oral history, which we really sort of think of as, core humanities, can be seen in different fields, in different lights. So she began to engage some of my students. She took one of my students to Puerto Rico to work on an amazing project there, another student who happens to be a historian journalist, Melody Hunter-Pillion. And so she and I have been working collaboratively around these questions of storytelling a scientific change. And when she showed me the images from Rising, she was like, we should do this. I thought, absolutely. Because what better way to tell a story than to really show us what it is, to show us, even in these beautiful images, the way this change is eroding our world and the spaces we find so valuable, and have found valuable in different ways over time. And for North Carolina and for the United States as a whole, I came to this question first through the Katrina disaster. And Matthew, you worked so well with me in training me and teaching me so much about the environmental side of the Katrina disaster. For me, it was a humanitarian crisis, and it was a question that brought race to the center of how we see our world. I'm a historian of New Orleans. I was a junior faculty member, and I watched Katrina unfold day after day. And I was horrified by the ways in which there's this differential sense of what storms and catastrophe and flooding and climate change might mean for communities of color, might mean for Black communities, might mean for Native communities in our country. And the language that we use to sort of dismiss the lives of the poor in times of crisis. The language that we use to dismiss people, to say, well, why don't you just move somewhere else then? This idea that simply being somewhere else is an easy thing for folks to do. So I've started teaching a course on Hurricane Katrina. I've taught it, I think, about 4 or 5 times now since the disaster. And it's always been such a fruitful thing for us to remember our history, remember our ties to the land that we live on, remember histories of displacement, histories of enslavement, histories of removal, and the ways in which those things have to be in conversation with the way we see our land now. And so we were looking for a space, Aransasu and I, we couldn't find any space at Hunt, everything was taken up. And so I was like, well, the African American Cultural Center has a beautiful space. And what better way to put these questions of history and place back into the conversation with this exhibit. So we were thrilled that they were available and willing to partner with us. And so it's been a great ride.
So I'd like to thank Blair for enunciating, because as all you all on the panel may not realize, these are not mics that project your voices, but merely that record them. So do bellow, do bellow. Baxter, I want to go to you next, because I think you can give us some context to the exhibit that this is really all built around. Could you tell us what Rising North Carolina is? Why did you do this artwork and these oral histories? And how did you choose these locations that we are appearing in the background?
Sure, absolutely. So whenever I talk about Rising, I first have to start with a story, because I'm a Southerner, and that's what we do, right? We connect with people through stories. And it started really when I was a kid. My dad is 83 years old, and he has also a penchant for storytelling. Our family is from the Outer Banks, specifically Hatteras Island, which, if you're not familiar, is about a 60-mile stretch of a sandbar, essentially, with one lane running down it. So we'd sit on the porch in the summer, and he would tell me stories about our family and how he used to get there, because there was no bridge when he started going there. And over the years, he's repeatedly told me this one story about my grandfather in particular. And if you're familiar with Hatteras Island, there is a Buxton Village specifically. On the north end of Buxton Village, there are a couple of motels all in a row, and they are continuously threatened by an encroaching sea. These are the hotels that are often pictured when Nat Geo comes down to report on sea level rise or climate change, and the bottom floor of the hotels is filled with sand. But in the 70s, my grandfather was offered this particular stretch of land for $3,000, and it's about, as best we can tell, 10 acres. And at that time, he looked, I think his sister was the one that made the offer, and he said, "No fool would ever build on the beach." Well, he was wrong, of course. And you know, my dad to this day still kind of tells that story with a little bit of tinge of regret, like, look what we missed out on. There's been this financial opportunity that we didn't have the vision for. But at that time, and this wasn't that long ago, this was in the 70s, families did not leave their high ground in the maritime forest to go live on a beach. So Ryan and I, you know, being out in the field and conducting oral histories for other projects, started to hear more and more of these types of stories of change, and you know, really started to realize that there was a lot of knowledge within local people that we felt hadn't been explored enough, and that local people who are living on the front lines of change day to day are the gatekeepers to these types of stories, that maybe if we could document these in a way that showed what they were living amongst, showed the uniqueness of the place that informs their daily lives, that shapes who they are, what they do, how they make their money, and how they adapt to their surroundings, could we create a narrative with their voices that shared kind of their struggles to adapt, or their stories of resilience and success. So we set out to do that, and came up with this idea for the project with Karen's advisement and a team of advisors, and Sea Grant and the Keenan Institute were generous enough to support this work. So over the course of about a year and a half, we conducted about 20 interviews and chose locations across Carteret, Dare, Hyde, Tyrrell, and Washington counties. And you know, that's kind of the outer and inner banks, if you recognize that term. And we chose those locations because the Outer Banks is so dynamic, and it's a constantly evolving sandbar. And you know, at first glimpse, the Outer Banks seems fragile, but it is so not fragile. We are fragile. The structures that we put on it are fragile. First and foremost, we wanted to take a deeper look at the Outer Banks and see what stories were there. And throughout these conversations, we came to realize that it's not just an Outer Banks problem. The people across the Sound are as deeply, if not more deeply, impacted by climate change and sea level rise. So that's kind of the gist of what we started out to do. Did I answer all of your questions?
You did, and you're being remarkably concise, people on this
good.
panel. I'm impressed by your internal clocks. Thank you. Karen, I want to go to you next, if that's all right, even if it's not all right.
Forget concise.
I send my time to Karen.
You're from Harkers Island. You have this deep connection there. And Harkers Island is one of the communities depicted in these images. Your museum is an important cultural center for Down East communities. What does this exhibit mean to you? And what would you like us here to know about the choices that your community faces?
First of all, I have to honor my favorite NC State person, Carmine Prioli, who's here in his retirement, because I keep, as I'm listening to this, I keep thinking he's been very involved with the development of the Coorstown Waterfowl Museum, which is and Heritage Center, which is really anything but a museum. And Carmine has told us all along this museum is going to tell us what it needs to be. And I say that as an introduction to when Baxter and Ryan started talking about this project, and I put her up in a helicopter to take pictures for me, and she came with all this beautiful imagery, and they started talking about this Rising exhibit, and I was going through everything they did, pulling out controversial words, because I live in Carteret County. The museum is funded by the state in a small way, but a very large way for us. And sea level rise was a no-no. And so I was a little nervous, but I did it anyway to bring this exhibition to Harkers Island. And like I said, we weighed and measured every word. And now, a year later, looking back, Carmine was right. This museum was where Rising should have been during Florence, because Florence has changed everything in my world, especially the conversation. And the reason I really believed in this in the beginning was we don't see what Baxter saw and documented. We live with it. It wasn't until I was riding across Stacy Marsh 6 or 8 years ago with Orrin Pilkey in my truck on our way to NCAT at Ocracoke, and he started talking to me about the dead trees in the marsh. I ride by them every day. Had never really put that all together. So for Rising to evolve out of the work, or in part the work that the Coorstown Waterfowl Museum does, and Baxter, whose connections up at Hatteras have been paramount in her perspective, I think that Rising was the right medium, the right project, in the right place at the right time for us to talk about it, because it's not just a science issue. It's not just an economic issue. It's not just a crowd of crazy academics talking about something they read about or they imagined. And now, after Florence, that beat us up pretty badly. Ocracoke and Hatteras got lucky this time. We were the northern edge, and I can tell you that the conversation has changed. People are not talking about if, they're talking about when. And for instance, the museum, we sustained $3.5 million in damage, and we, out of the box, said there will be a metal roof on this building. nothing else is even up for discussion. And I had to fight some of my board members because that was $200,000 more, but I can't help it. We got to have a metal roof, and you can't imagine the metal roofs that are going on. You can't imagine the people who are raising their houses. And this started with Isabel, but now it's everybody's talking about it. Isabel was the community of Davis and Sea Level and Stacy, and now it's across the board. So I'm honored to be a part of it. I hope that the people that I'm a part of, who this is not their first storm or their first migration as such, that we have helped inform it in terms of cultural history, because it is a people story above everything else.
That's a lovely segue to my question for you, Andre. You are studying coastal communities yourself.
Correct.
And they are facing rising seas. Why is the story of climate change an African American story in your work? What can communities like the ones you study teach us about resilience, about staying put?
Well, the Gullah Geechee community that I've been visiting with down in St. Helena Island in South Carolina arrived early 1700s with the sole purpose of cultivating rice in South Carolina. They came as slaves from rice patches in Sierra Leone to America, and that's just what they did. They no longer produce the rice, but they still grow the things that they have used to grow in okra, your squash, your melons, and so forth. So they have what you call, and I'm certain some people are familiar with the term of a citizen scientist, where these people who are taking notes, and this year the crops didn't grow this way, it didn't grow this way, and so forth. Well, as a historian, those stories become very important to us, because now those people become primary sources for us to go and look at and use this methodology of acquiring knowledge and memory, so we can take it in turn and help develop and push this narrative of who these people are and what does this land mean to them. So now I'm looking at stories of how they're altering the way that they grow certain things. The land that they inhabit now has been slammed with salt water, the seawater, and the salts get into the crops. So the soil is not growing things that they're used to growing at the same rate that they're used to doing it. So those stories become important because they've been there for so long. Like, they're a fixture in this community, and a lot of people go to these communities and they go to the gift shops and I want a piece of this culture, and they're buying things, but they're not learning about what's actually going on with the people. And that, to me, is the most interesting part of it all, because their stories are remarkable. I stood in a field with this one guy, and this was the day after Michael had blown through there, so you're talking right after Florence. And I'm sitting in my hotel room thinking, there's no way that this guy is going to have me out. Everything is going to be damaged. And I'm watching trees blow. There was no rain, but it was just heavy winds. And I sat out in this field with him, and I said, so when are you moving? And he said, I'm not. And I said, what's making you stay? And he said, why leave? He said, I have everything that I want right here. And then he takes me over to his bushes, and he shows me how his okra is not growing at the rate it used to. He showed me how the squash isn't growing anymore. And he pulls up this dead root. And I said, did this die? He said, no, this is as far as it matured. So now you're learning that it's not just the models that we see, the scientific models, but now this is the human story to this. This is the impact of the people and a culture that have been here for a couple of centuries. And it's just like, we're not leaving. We're going to stay put. We're just going to adapt to what's happening. So this adaptation, it's taken, maybe shift your crops inward a little bit. Maybe you have to plant in a different season. But they're steadily watching these storms, and it's just really interesting because everybody on the island, except for the hands, but maybe 2 or 3 people that are just moving into the island, are all looking at it and saying, displacement is going to become our factor. Adaptation has become a part of our daily lives. And these are the conversations that are happening in coffee shops and restaurants all the time. I walked into breakfast one morning, and the conversation was, so what happens when more trees fall? Where's the barrier? What are we going to do next? And these are just daily conversations, whereas though those of us who aren't directly impacted by these storms, we're talking about politics and sports. They're talking about how to adapt so they can continue their life and their culture.
So I have 2-3 hours worth of questions, which I'm not going to ask. But I am going to ask a broad question of the panel, maybe even two. And you all can dive in where you want. But it seems like, in particular, Karen, you and Andre will have something to say about this. You know, barrier islands and estuarine and shoreline, as we know, have never been stable in coastal North Carolina. And neither have the communities of our coastal regions in the eastern United States. For example, Baxter, you mentioned that in your own father's lifetime, the way we approach the Outer Banks, which is now in parts wall-to-wall houses, that was a very different relationship with even the recreational coastline. So, and Karen, I know that you have family history of folks who had to move.
Right.
Could you talk, you and the panel, all of y'all, a little bit about how you see what has been happening over the past decade or so and what you now expect to see in the future compared with the kinds of change that came before in those communities? And I throw that open to all four of you. Changes that have happened in the past and the kind of changes we are expecting in the future. How those two are different or similar.
I'll go. My crowd, my family, they came from Shackelford Banks. My grandmother moved to Harkers Island in 1903. She was 8 years old. My great-grandfather bought 60 acres for $60. And my mama's house is still on a piece of that land, and it is not for sale. It's you know, Carmine, in the book that he wrote about Harkers Island, he talked about adaptation. That's all we've ever done. That's all we've ever known. The storms, I did a presentation a few weeks ago and got reminded that there were 18 storms between 1879 and 1899. 18 named storms that hit Shackelford, the Outer Banks. And the crowd had gotten tired and weary. They fished for a living, they whaled, they built boats, it was a subsistence living, and the resources and the place that they used to make a life was changing. And they started talking about moving inland, and a few did, but the storm of 1899 was the final blow because the salt got in the dirt and turned it to sand, the salt got in the wells and turned to salt water, so they had to move to higher ground, and the majority of them moved to Harkers Island. There were some that moved to Salter Path, and there's a Salter Pather in the room. So he can tell you about his crowd, the Guthries, and to the promised land of Moorhead. So, and there they took their way of life and adapted it to a new place. If you fast forward that 120 years, a lot has changed. And it's not necessarily the landscape or the natural forces or the processes, it's we've changed. We think we're supposed to stay forever in the same place. We think land is, just because we buy it, is supposed to stay there, and it's not. We think that we can use it, we can love it to death and use it to death, and it's going to stand by us, and that's not the case. So this whole concept of moving because you live in a changing world is not new. We're the ones that have somehow begun to think that we are permanent. There's a lot more of us. The economy is based on that fragile piece of land of the Outer Banks. You know, don't say sea level rise on Hatteras Island too loud, because the realtors go ballistic. But the natural world is doing what it does, and the banks are moving inland. We somehow got to figure out how to get deed lines to migrate with us, because the land is moving and we're not. So I think, you know, when we talk, we spend a lot of time talking about how the landscape is changing. We need to stop and look at ourselves 100 years ago and realize that at that point we lived with what we had. Now we think we're in charge, and we're not.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And on a micro level, there's an example in the exhibition downstairs, and to speak to this, we build with different things, and I think that that really helps us in many ways. It helps heat and cool our homes better than it did in our parents' generations. But in our parents or grandparents' generations on the Outer Banks, when a storm would have come, they would have let the tide in, and they would have had a plug in the floor that, when the tide was going out, they could have pulled, let drain, and so the house wouldn't float off the foundation. And as the tide was going out, they'd sweep the tide out with the silt and go on about their lives. But if tide gets in your house now, you got to tear the drywall down, you've got to tear the carpet up, you got a mess. And what we saw in several of the interviews that we conducted was that people are returning to a less modern way of building. There's a gentleman in Hatteras Village who has made the downstairs of his guest apartment, garage turned guest apartment, and taken all the insulation, all the drywall out, put foam insulation and hardy board as walls, and when the water comes in, he can open the doors up, let it dry out, and live in it again, and not tear out the walls again. And I think that's resilience and adaptation at its best, is returning to a way that we once lived, and not expecting to stay the way that we are now, like Karen described.
What I've seen is people moving from the north, coming down into St. Helena Island and buying plots of land. And I was at breakfast at the same hotel, and a woman comes in and she says to this guy, "I want no proof that trees ever existed on this land." And I'm sitting there thinking, she must be from the north. And she says, "Because I'm from the north." And I said, "Yeah, we figured that part out." But they're buying these plots of land to build these homes to be close to the beaches. And everybody likes to go to the beach, but you're ignoring the fact of what you're actually walking into. You're ignoring the historical point of it. There's no basis for you to move there other than you want to be close to the beach. And that's fine. But also realize these storms are not getting weaker, they're getting stronger. So as you're building closer to the beach, expect to see over years, like you said, it's not going to be there forever. They're not taking that into consideration. And by disturbing the land, by removing things, you're only making it worse. And they're not taking any of that into consideration. So it's really sad to see.
And from a historian's perspective, there used to be an understanding that you could not build a house on the sand, like just the story that you said, that that this wasn't an okay thing, it wasn't sustainable. You could visit that space, but that you should live farther away from the water because of that changeability, because of that vulnerability. And it's interesting, as a historian, I've studied African Americans in all different parts of the country, and the land that was thought to be least valuable was the land that would flood. And so oftentimes African American communities ended up in spaces that were flood prone. Hilton Head Island, where I've gone a few times with my family, at one point was a majority African American space in South Carolina. When the culture changed and everyone decided that beach vacations were the thing that everyone should do, removal of those communities is what happened, and people are building directly on the beach. And so populations that had once had an understanding of how to live in more challenging spaces, of all different kinds of backgrounds, were removed for a culture of resort. And with that culture of resort, you lose a lot of the knowledge and the ability to even sustain in these changing environments. And so if we change how we think about what we deserve in terms of human space, I think it's different. So we stop insisting that the federal government, maintain my house in this spot, as opposed to thinking of, well, I'm enjoying this place, but I know it's vulnerable, and this is how I'm going to approach it. Is a different way to think about the world, and I think a different way that we all have to come to think about what we deserve and who needs access to these different kinds of spaces.
Well, I want to acknowledge that I misspoke earlier. When I was talking about resilience, I said staying put. But one of the points that you all have made is that resilience doesn't just mean staying put. It means finding ways to migrate, either seasonally or when conditions just no longer permit you to stay put. I have another hour and 30 minutes worth of questions, but I would like to open it up to the audience and to ask you about your questions for this extraordinary group of panelists. Yes, Daryl, and I'm going to repeat your questions.
Okay. So, Karen, and you know I've been out to Core Sound many times, especially with working with the partnership with the Smithsonian. I saw you nodding your head when Ryan was talking about some aspects of the impact on Gullah Geechee culture within the context of those fields and the gentleman's experience he was sharing with us. And so my question actually to both of you is, because I want to know if there really are similarities in what we're seeing relative to the impact. Foodways and cultural traditions, the boating traditions there, foodways and the like there in what some of us like to refer to as Gullah Land, are impacted in various ways here, I think. But I was wondering if you could share some of those specific traditions, like the boating traditions and shrimping and foodways there, how that may be impacted. Is Sweetwater impacted relative to the basket making and all? And are there similarities that either of you see within the context of coastal South Carolina and coastal North Carolina?
So Dr. Stover's questions, I'm going to boil right down to, had to do with foodways and with lifeways in these two very different places, or seemingly different communities of the Gullah Geechee, the Gullah Land, and of the landscape that Karen has been describing.
So one thing that I have noticed with the sweetgrass baskets, a lot of people want to buy them and have a piece of Gullah culture in their house, and the baskets are extremely expensive. If anybody's ever looked for one, they're not cheap. So I go into this store and I see one, and it's for $1,500. And I love my wife, I do. But $1,500 is a bit much. But there was an identical one sitting right next to it that was about $400 cheaper. So I asked the question, why? And the answer was given, well, the sweetgrass crops are dying off because of the salt water. So now what we're doing is we're putting straw into the middle of those baskets to stretch it out. So you're getting sweetgrass on the outside, but not on the inside in some cases. And that was in October. And I'll be going back down again in April to look. But you also saw with okra. Okra was one of those things where I went to go buy okra because everybody had okra. And it wasn't as much okra that was growing, and everybody was saying because of salt water getting into the crops, heat, the plants aren't maturing fast enough, and they're used to these plants getting up to be about 6-7 feet tall and being able to pick, and they're not growing that high, and they're not producing as much of the vegetation as well. So those are the things that I'm seeing when I go there, specifically with the sweetwater grass.
With us, like I mentioned, on the Shackelford Banks communities 100 years ago, that was a big reason why they moved to inland, is because they had pear trees and fig trees, and they grew gardens on Shackelford, and they couldn't do that anymore. So they had to go somewhere where they could have a garden. More and more people home are having raised bed gardens. So, I mean, I've noticed that there's nowhere near the agricultural tradition home that there used to be. So from a farming standpoint, slightly, but in the fisheries, it's a major issue. After the storm, they were catching shrimp like crazy off Currituck and Virginia Beach. That's way far north than shrimp usually run. We're catching things now that are usually off the coast of Georgia and Florida, are coming our way because the ocean is warmer, and those fish don't care where they are as long as the water's right. So yes, the economy around commercial fishing is certainly changing, and I'll say this to your connection to us connecting, Dr. Emery Campbell, who founded the Penn Center. We had him come to Harkers Island down east 10 or 15 years ago, and I went to the Penn Center, and the more I learned about that culture and the issues they were facing, you know, far beyond sea level rise with the development and the crowd who think they're buying a piece of land that's going to stay there, and all these cultural impacts, people wanting to buy a piece of the culture. I had somebody say to me last night about cultural poachers. They're talking about the Smith Island cake that's now being made on the mainland. They left the Smith Islanders out. So the parallels are limitless, really, because it's working people living off the land and out of the water that are being impacted by not only climate change and sea level rise, but a whole new economy.
Thanks so much for really fascinating observations and thoughts. I was wondering, you've talked a lot about change and changes in communities. Have you seen changes in the ways people are interpreting the ecological changes they're seeing? Like, are people now starting to talk about this shrinking okra might be related to climate change, or like, how are they talking about this?
So the question is, are people connecting the changes they're seeing, for example, in the okra crop, to the the changing climate?
Okra's your subject.
Okay. So discussions are being held, different aspects. In April, there's going to be a sea level rise conference down in St. Helena Island that the Gullah Geechee are hosting themselves. They've been, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Queen Quet, who's the high chiefess of the Gullah Geechee community. She is very adamant about getting the word out about the community and the effects of sea level rise, climate change, displacement. She's very outspoken about that, and she has an international forum on that. What she's done is held meetings, quarterly meetings and conferences, and then speaking at these conferences draw attention to the same crowd of people who are coming in to buy plots of land and come in to vacation with families and such, to let them know exactly what's happening to them once everybody leaves. So she's very outspoken about that, and she sends out email blasts, she sends out, she's really big on Instagram and YouTube for some odd reason. But even in the music that she creates, because she's a musician, she creates music and it has a message in every song about things that are impacting the Gullah Geechee community. And also it talks about the history of, so it's like you get a full lesson of, here's what happened, here's how we got here, here's what's going on, here's now. You know, so there's definitely a lot of discussion about it locally within the community, as well as outside of the community and around the world, based on what Queen Quet is letting people know.
I wish that was the case home.
Well, I think the fact that you were willing to host a community conversation
I'm
about this to a
brave.
full house.
I'm crazy.
But people showed up. I mean,
Yeah, they did. I will say though that the ones who showed up, what?
Yeah.
Fisheries panel.
Yeah, absolutely.
That kind of occurred on stage and the way that conversation evolved. Share a little bit about the community.
Yeah, we hosted a community conversation, a day long. We didn't call it a symposium because that was too spooky. So we started out with a panel of fishermen, recreational and commercial fishermen, and they started just rattling off all the different species they were seeing, the changes in the currents, the changes in the bottom, the grasses, and all that. And so, I mean, they were right out there with it. And then we had different groups of people. We had about 100 people, I guess, who came during the day, and we had invited some town officials and some politicos and all that. It was interesting that the majority of the people who showed up were the people that were somehow related to an environmental movement or an academic community college, whatever. The majority of the few local indigenous species who were there was in the fishermen and those of us who had pushed and pulled and got a handful of people there. So the conversation is very different among the sectors of our population, whether it's, we have a very strong marine science community in Carteret County, NOAA, UNC, CMAS, National Marine Fisheries. I mean, we have lots of PhDs in the neighborhood of the marine science ilk, and they're talking about it, and the fishermen are talking about it. Local people, since the storm, are talking about it, but they're not calling it sea level rise. They're calling it tide. And in that panel was people from Smith Island in Chesapeake Bay, which is the island north of Tangier, the crowd waiting for the wall. And so we brought in Tom Horton, who is an environmental writer from up that way, and they were part of the conversation. And if you've if you've read or you had the chance to read the book Chesapeake Requiem, I encourage you to do that, because the writer there goes through that whole year and a half he lived on Tangier and realized it's really a matter of semantics, because they're talking about erosion. Well, you can call it erosion, you can call it sea level rise, you can call it tide, you can call it anything you want to. The impacts are the same. And everybody on Smith Island is dealing with it. They call it tide and erosion there. And I was there for 3 weeks this past winter, and I waded in the water half the time I was there. I mean, the tide never really goes away there anymore. And they've got people there dredging, and they've got a bulkhead being built on one side trying to protect themselves from that westerly erosion. Now, they're not going to call it sea level rise because of the political element. So I would say down in East Carteret County, and Carteret County in particular, it all depends on who you're talking to, what the terminology is. And the same way I would say up at Hatteras. It depends on who pays your bills, what your conversation looks like. Because if you're in the real estate market, you're not going to talk about that. If you're in the marine science community, you will talk about it. So it's complicated. It's very complicated. You got to be able to talk in all those different languages to really find out what people are doing. And what they're doing is adapting. And having lots of questions about, do I stay or do I go? And that's a complicated question.
You're reminding me that I often tell my students that the only thing that changes faster than natural systems is culture. Culture can change faster, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, we're not into that change stuff.
I'm going to get to you, Walt, but I'm going to take one more question first. In the third row? Yes.
Hi, thanks so much for being here, you guys. I was wondering, it seems like, it differs amongst communities whether people are talking about adaptation and resilience. Do you see people who are acknowledging climate change as the driving force? Do you see people moving beyond acknowledgement of resilience and adapting to more like activism and prevention as opposed to adaptation, and people getting more involved in the environmental movement?
Not really.
Well, yeah, I think it's community by community. There are few and far between in the communities that we interviewed people in, or that we came into contact with, that I would classify as an activist. I think it's more comfortable to talk about, and more realistic really, to talk about adaptation and resilience than it is prevention, because prevention comes with a connotation that we've done something wrong to get to where we are, and that's a really hard pill for people to swallow. And so I think, at least in the communities that Rising has served, adaptation and resilience stories framed in a process of change, not necessarily climate change or sea level rise, but how has your surrounding, how has your place changed? Then they give you the anecdote for climate change and sea level rise. So.
Yeah, well, I'm a climate scientist. Maybe I have a more apocalyptic view of the future than we've heard enunciated. So I'm wondering, as Matthew alluded to earlier, the ultimate form of human adaptation is to move somewhere else when things get bad. So I guess there's a two-pronged question there. One is, well, maybe a three-part question. One is, are people thinking about moving? The second one is, what are the prospects or models for people maintaining cultural cohesion when they move? And the third question is, what if you want to move and someone doesn't want you to move where you want to move to?
Can you folks in the back hear that? Yeah? All right, I'll do my best, because Walt asked 3 questions.
I'm a professor.
He says I'm a professor, so that's his excuse. Fair enough. The third question was, what if you want to move and people won't let you move where you wish to move? Yeah? Second question, Walt?
Cultural models for maintaining cultural cohesion when you do move.
Models for maintaining cultural cohesion if and when you do move. And I'm sorry, Walt, the first question.
Are people starting to move?
Yeah. Are people moving?
Yeah.
So I think New Orleans is an interesting example by which to think about it, in particular because Katrina has this long run, right? So what was really interesting to me was, as a person who studied turn of the 20th century New Orleans, because I was studying Plessy versus Ferguson, I made maps, and so I was making streetcar maps and city maps. So I knew exactly what the city looks like at the turn of the 20th century. And there was this big swamp area right off on the other side. And that swamp area was untouched. There was no habitation. It was a barrier for the city. That had been part of the natural barrier for the city for centuries. That barrier is the Ninth Ward. And so in the 20th century, those swamps were drained, those trees were cleared, and houses were put there. Now, with the knowledge that those houses would be more vulnerable to flooding. And in fact, they were flooded over and over through the disasters of the 20th century. Those became majority African American communities, in part because of that devaluation of land. And so it was interesting to me to be pulled all the way through, so they were pushing black people out of the city center. The African American communities had lived in city center. It was the least segregated kind of city at the turn of the 20th century because it had a backyard model. So you'd have your big house in the front and your small houses in the alleys behind those houses. And so there was no sort of racial dot mat that you could have drawn of a good 20th century, turn of the 20th century New Orleans. They created one with segregation in the post-Plessy period where you had black neighborhoods in New Orleans for the first time. And in doing so, they inadvertently made the entire city more vulnerable to the same storms. And so, but that's not to say that those communities didn't become a real thing. That to be from the lower ninth meant you were from there, you grew up there, your family could have been there for 100 years. And so it had meaning, and it still has meaning. There's something that I believe a sociologist calls root shock, right? So if you take people out of their lived context, they don't know quite how to relate to other people, those contexts of how to find work, where to shop, where to eat, who your social community is, your church, your faith. All those things are part of those lived spaces, right? And so people are holding on to those communities, not just because that's where they own property, but that's their network. That's the network that they have available to them. And so part of what was awful about Katrina is the way that people were put on buses and sent all over the country where they had no context, where they could not have a network, where they had no control over where they ended up. We have seen those folks, rebuild and refigure out where they could be in community, in Houston, in Atlanta. Those are the diaspora communities for New Orleans. But I think there's something when we say that poorer people or working people don't have the right to think about where they should go. They should simply just get to a better space, learn to live somewhere where it doesn't flood. I've heard people say that about Princeville in North Carolina, right? Learn to live somewhere else. But when we don't take into account the meaning of lived culture, those networks, we're missing the big picture. And there's a great model of learning how to do that, the Great Migration. When African Americans moved en masse out of the South to cities in the North, they did that on those networks. They did that. Whole neighborhoods would be from the same community. My family was from Accomack, Virginia, my father's family, moved off of the Eastern Shore en masse to Philadelphia. They lived in the same neighborhood. If you looked around the block, they knew their cousins and family. And my family from South Carolina moved en masse to Philadelphia within a generation. Looking at my ancestry, it was remarkable that I'm not related to anybody in Newberry, South Carolina anymore, because the entire family moved in those networks. And so when we think about people, we have to remember that they're living their life. They're not atomized. They're not alone. They are living, particularly working and poor folk. That's how who watches their kids, who tends to their household, who helps them when they're sick. If they don't have these, grand insurance plans and fancy daycare, this is how you live life. And so we have to remember that about people and the way that they live.
The Gullah Geechee aren't any different from that. You'll have sects that will go from St. Helena Island, and you'll find them in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York. But then you have a place like the Penn Center where annually they host an event. It's almost like a homecoming, right, for you to come back and celebrate and enjoy the culture. But that as those people migrate north for jobs or whatever the situation may be, you're also seeing a gentrification of St. Helena, you know, where it's just like you see people coming from the north that are not African Americans coming in and buying up the land and building these enormous homes, clearing out trees. So you see the swap and you see the change of what's happening there up close and personal, you know. But as far as keeping that connection to culture, a lot of those people are never going to stop growing and building beds in their backyards to grow your okra, your tomatoes, your squash. You know, it's not going to stop them from preparing their meals the same way. There's always going to be that connection. And then, you know, once a year, I think it's in October, everybody comes right back. There's a big celebration, then you go back to your own places. But because people have moved within families, you know, you'll call, how is this area? Okay, I'm going to come visit. The visit turns into you stay. You know, you buy your home, and you keep moving. Then the next group, same situation, and the next generation, same thing. So you'll have people that are outside St. Helena Island in different places where they have those networks in place too, so they can travel and move.
To answer the question of a model, going back to Shackelford, that was called Diamond City, that collection of communities. It's been 120 years since the 1899 storm, and we're having homecoming on the 17th of August.
Hello.
And our tagline is, we're remembering people we didn't know, going home to a place we've never lived. Because it was our grandparents and our great-grandparents that lived there, but we're still very connected in pods, like where they migrate, because they left in mass over a period of 4 or 5 years, so they had that advantage. But to answer your question about are people leaving, a few are, especially from communities like Davis and Sea Level, where the land is so low, and they're having problems getting mortgages, insurance. They're moving to Beaufort or Moorhead, closer to jobs. They're not really moving far. You know, where would you go? Kinston? I mean, who wants to go to Kinston? But you know, I'm going to quote my brother from another mother, Ernie Foster. And when you're rambling the internet tonight, Google National Geographic. Can't remember what it's titled, but you'll find it. But basically, Ernie, who's a Hatterasser, he is talking with this interviewer, and they're in the cemetery. And cemeteries are real important in our world. And he's showing the interviewer his grandparents, and he says, and I'll be buried here. And he goes on to explain that that's where he belongs, and that's where he will end up. And he asked the question, why should I be any different than this place that I'm a part of? Why should I be any more permanent than this place? Because we're all terminal. And if it washes away, I wash with it. Wow. And I'm kind of with him on that. I mean, that's the difference in being from a place and buying a place. And buying is not owning.
So I want to emphasize 2 points that we just heard. The first is that Americans have moved a lot in the past, and sometimes they've moved in atomistic ways, as we're like the buying and not owning. And sometimes they've moved in this form of chain migration, where people find a home and they flock to it in mass as a community. And I think that's really important for us to remember. This is not the first time. And many of the people who moved in mass to the United States or from places in the United States, like the Deep South in the age of Jim Crow, did so because they were fleeing as much as they were going to. They were being pulled as well as being pushed. And the second point we heard is about ways of coming home. Ways of coming home that even if the land is no longer inhabitable 12 months of the year, it can be inhabited, it can be remembered, it can be reoccupied. And some of those meanings, some of that memory, some of that meaningfulness can be reimagined, refelt. I think those are both really powerful points, simple points, but powerful points. Julie, I think you had a question. You had your hand up.
Is there still time?
Yes, I think we have time for another question. Okay, I'm getting the red flag. This is it?
Okay.
So enunciate.
It's been really rich with the localities and hearing about peoples, but I was struck, Andre, by you starting to talk about the international kind of advocacy or scope, and thinking about what Blair started and ended with, poor and vulnerable people are in multiple places, and that's true around the world, right? So I'm just curious, what can other places learn from these local experiences? What can our localities learn from other places? Would that help with some of that question about, I'm not an activist, but I can see other people struggling, so maybe I start to think in new ways. What kinds of intersections or communication are happening or might happen?
So let me just summarize real quick for our camera. Americans aren't the only ones, North Carolinians aren't the only ones facing dislocation. What might people, and it's generally the vulnerable in our society who are facing it, what might we learn from people elsewhere in the world who are also facing the same kind of vulnerabilities, and what might we offer? Is that fair?
That's fair.
Okay.
Can I toss in one number real quickly? So Cornell scientists just estimated we were talking 2 billion people displaced by sea level rise within the next several decades.
2 billion is the global estimate for people displaced by sea level rise in the next 20 years.
No, in the next several decades.
In the next several decades.
So, Queen Quet in particular, going before the United Nations and talking about what's happening in St. Helena Island, people in Sierra Leone are going through similar things. Coincidentally, they came from Sierra Leone back in the 1700s. So you have their ears, because not only are you going through the same things, but we share a bloodline. We are each other. You are me, I am you. Then you have other areas in West Africa that are going through these same infiltrations, and we all share the Atlantic Ocean. So now these people are coming together and say, well, this happening here, it's happening there. And when you go before that larger body, they may not call it activism as much as they would say they're just talking, but it is a form of activism, because now you are showing the common ground that you share with the people on different continents. And by doing that, now all of a sudden you have this conglomerate that's coming together that, once together, it's a larger voice. It's not just one person from St. Helena, one person from Sierra Leone. Now you have hundreds of people that have come together to voice their concerns about one thing. And when you go before a body like the United Nations, other countries start to chime in now. Now you have the grand stage. It's not just us in this room. It's not a city council meeting. This is the world. And everybody is coming to listen and play at the same time. So you're seeing these moves. They're not going for just the small meetings anymore, but they're expanding to find and reaching across to grab hands with people in different nations to show that we're going through the same exact things. Let's come together. So they're dismissing the fact that there are the cultural differences and realizing that there's the life similarity, and they're coming together for that.
I think in my community, in particular down east Carteret County, I think the 50, 60, 70 somethings are just right now absorbed with getting a roof back on their house. They've heard this conversation in third person before. We've grown up hearing about storms. Storms not a new, it's not a new thing. Jim Cantore didn't invent it. So I think in a lot of ways, and I'm thinking about it now, I think we're somewhat storm numb, because we should expect it. We've been acclimated to it. And I think now the mothers and especially the elderly, took a really hard hit in Florence, and a lot of people have been displaced, having to move in with children or whatever. So everybody right now is still in survival mode. I hope that we can find ways that we can take the 20, 30 somethings and the high school students and get them in this conversation, because they're the ones that's really going to have to face music. Mm-hmm. And I got to tell my Casey story. You knew that.
Yeah.
I've got 2 children. One's 31, one's 34. My 31-year-old will not leave for anything. She graduated from college, came back home. She's there to stay. My oldest one went to school of science and math and ended up in New York City at Columbia University. And so he's a man of the world. He's here, there, and everywhere. And so Christmas before last, while he was home, I said, well, I think we were on our way back to the airport. And I said, Casey, I said, Daddy and I are trying to get our stuff together, get our things in order. Because my mother was getting elderly then, and we were dealing with all those life issues. And I said, you're the oldest. I said, you know, we're going to figure out a way that we've got our house. The house I live in was my grandmother's house, and it was her grandmother's house. So there's 6 generations of my crowd on that piece of land. And then Mama's house is on some of that William Henry Guthrie, 60 acres for $60 Shackelford land. I said, and we're going to figure out a way that I want to hold on to Grandmama's. I said, which house do you want? And he was very quiet. And then he said, how about neither? And I died. And I said, Casey, why? He says, Mama, it's not going to be here in 50 years. So that's a then 32-year-old applied math major's perspective on the reality of what the situation is. And I said, well, Casey, I can't help it. I can't help it. And we revisit the subject every now and then, and he stands his ground that it's not going to be there. And he's probably right, but that's okay. I'll go with it. So it's complicated, people. It's not a science, it's not a history, it's not a sociology, it's all those things, it's life. And everybody has to make their own decision. And it's hard because you've got economics in it. A lot of people want to raise their houses, they can't afford it. They got to wait till it floods so FEMA will come help, then they can borrow the money to raise it. So people want to stay. My people want to stay, and they're not ready to give it up yet.
I think one of the things that I've taken away from especially this conversation and our work with Rising, and you know, if you look at climate change or foodways or ways of living and culture and places, we're all more alike than we are different. And how can we, climate change and being at risk to the impacts of climate change and sea level rise is kind of a system that levels the playing field in some way between cultures that are seemingly different. How can we learn from maybe people in the Netherlands that have been dealing with this for generations, and how can we learn from the Gullah Geechee, and how can we open those lines of communication up for more than anything for our people at the coast? That's what I would love to see, is some sort of knowledge exchange between areas that different communities that have this expertise longer than we do.
Okay, well, this is not the end, this is the beginning. But I want to take a moment now and thank all of our panelists for this extraordinary And I also want to make 2 more thanks. One is important and I left it out, it's a crucial one. And that is the research office of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, which gave the grant, which allowed Rising to come to the African American Cultural Center tonight. So I thank you. Tom Berkland, I know you're here, and on behalf of the research office, thank you. I'd also like to thank again Sechelle Ford and John Miller and the staff and the director of the African American Cultural Center here at NC State for hosting this exhibit and us tonight. And special thanks to Arancessu Lascardine, who has worked for months to make this thing happen. So, Arancessu. Please visit with one another here and at the reception and poster exhibit downstairs on the 2nd floor. Don't miss the student posters from all across campus. And absolutely do not miss Ricky Moore's food. You'll be sad if you do. So please eat joy with one another and be well. One last thing. Tomorrow at 5:30 in Hunt Library, Nancy Langston, environmental historian Nancy Langston, will be speaking about climate change, about some success stories in conservation history, and about some of the warnings of what's ahead. So please come to Hunt Library tomorrow at 5:30 for Nancy's lecture. It's the 2019 Buchdahl Lecture. Thank you. Thanks.
So how is it? I mean, is he